Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Michelle Leonard. Now, Michelle Leonard is a professional genealogist and genetic genealogist from Glasgow, where she runs the company Genes and Genealogy, and she specializes in finding your unknown ancestors and also in adoption searches. Now, Michelle is a freelance writer in addition, and she has a chapter in a book coming out.
Several chapters.
Several chapters in a book coming out shortly, which she'll tell you about at the end of the lecture. But here to talk about autosomal DNA and how to make the most of it, please give a warm welcome to Michelle Leonard.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about making the most of your autosomal DNA test. I'm going to cover a little bit about what autosomal DNA is and autosomal DNA inheritance patterns, how to use autosomal DNA results to help you with your family history research, how to work with your DNA match lists. I'll throw in a few success stories, case studies, a little bit about the X-chromosome, and a little bit about third-party tools. So what can you use autosomal DNA testing for? Well, you can use it to confirm and support your family tree research that you've already done, identify and connect with new cousins, add new branches to your family tree, break down brick walls, adoption, illegitimacy, and all manner of unknown ancestor mysteries, testing theories about relationships, and learning about your ethnic makeup. And you'll notice I put that last, because for me, it's the least important of these. So, a disclaimer before we get started. Be prepared and prepare others. Before you decide to test or you ask someone else to test for you, be aware of the possible consequences of testing, things that you could find out. You may find out that some of your ancestors, even very close ones, are not who you think they are. Or you may match with very close relatives you previously didn't know existed, adoptees, etc. So you have to just be very aware of these possibilities before deciding to test. So what is autosomal DNA? Well, it's a random blend of all the DNA passed down to you from all of your direct ancestors. It covers all of your DNA, unlike Y-DNA tests or mitochondrial DNA tests, which just cover one line of your tree. Each new generation with autosomal DNA, some DNA from previous generations drops off. So you have less of your grandparents than you do of your parents, and so on as you go back in time. So this limits the reach of autosomal DNA to around the past 5 to 7 generations. Now, you will get matches further back than that, because we all have many, many more 6th, 7th, 8th cousins than we do 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. But just be aware that it's much more difficult to confirm connections the further back you go. So where can you test? What companies do this kind of testing? Well, there are now 5 major testing companies that offer direct-to-consumer autosomal DNA tests. Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Living DNA are these companies. You want to try and get in the databases of all the major testing companies if you can, because you don't know where your best matches are going to choose to test. We, in the genetic genealogy world, like to call it going on a fishing trip. And if you're not fishing in all the different ponds, you might miss your big fish that's going to help you verify that one line you're interested in, or break that particular brick wall, or identify that mystery ancestor. FTDNA, MyHeritage, and Living DNA all accept transfers, so you can download your raw data from, say, Ancestry and upload to those companies. Living DNA now has a matching database as well, but it is very small and it is just starting out, so don't expect much from it yet. FTDNA, MyHeritage, and Living DNA are all exhibiting out in the room today. So how is autosomal DNA inherited? Well, in the nucleus of every human cell, there are 46 chromosomes, the building blocks of DNA. 23 pairs overall, and I always emphasize the word pairs because it's such an important concept to get your head around, the fact that you have 2 copies of each of these chromosomes. There are 22 pairs of autosomes, hence the name of the type of DNA. And there's one pair of sex chromosomes. That's chromosome number 23, or the X and the Y. If you're female, you get 2 X's, one from mum and one from dad. And if you're male, you get an X from mum and a Y from dad. So it's the gender chromosome that you get from your father that defines your gender. And this is what they look like. And as I say, there they are, in pairs, exact copies. The largest is chromosome 1, and then they get increasingly smaller until you get down to the smallest, chromosome 21 and 22. The X chromosome is a reasonably large chromosome. It's 3 times larger than the very small Y chromosome. So how does it work? Well, here's mum and dad, and here's you for the purposes of this illustration. You are female. Dad has 22 pairs of autosomes, 1 pair of sex chromosomes. He's got the X and Y. Mum also has 22 pairs of autosomes and a pair of sex chromosomes. She's got the 2 X's. Recombination takes place, and actually that takes place when your parents are in the womb, but that's a whole other story. Dad passes down 1 set of 22 new autosomes. That's half of his 44, all jumbled up together to you, and his unchanged X direct from his mother. Mum passes down a set of 22 new autosomes, half of her 44 again mixed together, and one of her X chromosomes, either a mix of her 2 or one of them unchanged, which can happen. So you've now got 22 pairs of autosomes of your own from your parents and 2 X chromosomes. Since you're female, you'd have an X and Y if you were male. So you inherit progressively less DNA from your ancestors with each passing generation. 50% from parents, around 25% from grandparents, around 12.5% from great-grandparents, and so on. It halves each generation. It's important to familiarize yourself with the average amounts of DNA different relationships should share with you. DNA inheritance is random, so you have to think in ranges and not absolutes. And outliers are always possible. Outliers are matches who share much lower or much higher than the average with you, and I'll talk a bit more about them. So you want to get to grips with this, the range of sharing percentages. 50% between a parent and a child, around 50% with a full sibling, around 25% with a half sibling, a grandparent, grandchild, aunt, uncle, niece, nephew, or double first cousin. You can see that there are a lot of different relationships that can share pretty much the same amount of DNA with you. So you have to keep that in mind. By the time we get down to third cousins, you're only going to share around 0.78% of your DNA with a third cousin. The only absolute is that you share 50% with each parent. All the rest are approximate. You could inherit, say, 22% from one grandparent and 28% from the other. It's really all down to how the cards fall during that recombination process. So the next thing you need to get your head around with autosomal DNA are centimorgans, and these are very important. A centimorgan is a unit for measuring genetic linkage, which is usually abbreviated to a small c and a large M. The most important thing to remember about centimorgans is the larger the number, the closer the match, okay? And that is really all you really need to know about them. So let's look at the average. The average between a parent and a child is 3,500 centimorgans. The average with a full sibling, 2,600. A half sibling, 1,780. A first cousin or a half niece, 875. A second cousin or a half first cousin once removed, 230, etc. It gets smaller and smaller. So I talked about those are the averages, and I said to you, but you need to think in ranges. And how do you do that, and where do you do that? Well, the place to do that is the Shared CM project. And the Shared CM project is a fantastic resource for helping with relationship predictions that is compiled by Dr. Blaine Bettinger in the United States. He has collated over 25,000 genuine results and put together a lot of fantastic histograms and charts showing both the averages and especially the ranges for each relationship. So let's just have a look at a couple on this chart. This is half sibling, and the average between all of the half siblings that have put their data in is 1,783. But look at the range, it's so large, 1,300 to 2,300. So what I was talking about earlier about outliers, if somebody was sharing 1,300 and a half sibling, that's a very low sharing outlier. If someone was a half sibling sharing 2,300, that's a very high sharing outlier. But you can't just look at this range and assume that it's an outlier when somebody is sharing way less or way more than they should with you. Because the most likely thing is that the relationship isn't correct. It's more likely it's incorrect than it's an outlier, because outliers are rare. So you always have to look at the most likely outcomes before assuming outliers. Again, second cousin, the average is 233, but the range, 46 to 515. So most people in these relationships are going to share somewhere around the average with you. Now, the best tool for working with this is the Shared CM Project DNA Painter tool created by Johnny Pearl. And this automates this whole process for you. It's absolutely brilliant. So if you go to the tool, you've got a new match, no matter which platform it's on. My advice is always, whenever you get a new match in, look for the number of centimorgans you share with them, head over to the Shared CM Project tool and plug it in there. The companies give you relationship estimates, but they're pretty broad and they can't give you all of the different possibilities in the one place. Or most of them don't anyway. So let's have a look at how it works. We're going to plug in a high number, 1,750. And it tells us that's 23% of your DNA. If you're working on 23andMe, they give you it in percentage in the first place, so you can put the number in the percentage box instead. And this tells us that this is 100% likely to be a grandparent, aunt, uncle, half-sibling, niece, nephew, or grandchild. So that person that's matching you with that amount of DNA has to be one of those relationships. It's giving you all the possibilities and it's telling you it's 100%. Now that's because it's a very high amount of DNA. You've got a lot more possibilities if you share a lower amount of DNA with someone. Let's say it's just 50 centimorgans, 0.6% of your DNA. Look at all of these possibilities on the chart there. 30% that it's a half-third cousin or a third cousin once removed, 24% that it's one of all of these, fifth cousin twice removed, etc. 21%, it could be a fourth cousin, half-third cousin once removed. There's all sorts of possibilities. Always start with the most likely and work your way through the possibilities. It's very unlikely it's a half-second cousin, but occasionally there will be outliers, and it will be that. And Ancestry have now done something similar to the Shared CM project. It's very new. It's called the DNA Relationship Table. And this is my dad's first cousin, Anne, who I'm matching at 337 centimorgans. And if I now click on this on Ancestry, they're going to bring up a table similar to the Shared CM project with the probability percentages. It's a 53% probable that she's my first cousin once removed, and that's exactly what she is. So what about these outliers? Well, this is Anne again, my dad's first cousin, and my sister, and they're only sharing 215 centimorgans. So what's the probability for that? Remember, they're supposed to be first cousins once removed. Well, the probability is that it's only 6% probable that they're actually the relationship they show on paper. However, we've already seen I share a lot more with Anne. Several of my first cousins who I've tested also share a lot more with her. One of them shares 429, which gives us a probability of 81% that they're first cousins once removed. The key, however, is that to look at the matches that Anne has. We share her grandparents, my great-grandparents. Does she have matches to both of our common ancestors? And she does. She does match both of our common ancestors with different confirmed cousins. So always look for independent confirmed matches to the common ancestors. If you can find matches to both, you've likely got an outlier. But as I say, don't let confirmation bias get in the way. Don't just look at the range and say, oh, well, it's close enough, the relationship must be right. Always look at the most likely possibilities first, and oftentimes when you see a very big outlier, the most likely possibility is that the relationship is incorrect and there's something wrong in the paper trail. You need evidence to prove outliers. Okay, so genetic generations versus age. So this is Mr. Hamilton, and his great-grandparents were Joseph and Agnes. And this is my mum, and they were her third great-grandparents. So Mr. Hamilton and my mum are second cousins twice removed. So clearly he's going to be pretty old, right? Well, actually, he's 3 years younger than my mum. He's 2 generations closer, but he's 3 years younger than she is. What's going on? Well, this guy here is what's going on. Mr. James Hamilton, his granddad, who was fathering children for over the span of about half a century. And Mr. Hamilton's father was one of those he fathered in his 60s. So we can see where those 2 generations went. And on my mum's side, there were some quite short generations. So you can't always go by age. It's useful to know the age of your match and try to work out what the relationship might be from that. And of course, once again, always start from the most likely. 2 people of a similar age are always most likely to be the same generation. But they can be a generation removed, and even in extreme examples like that, 2 generations removed. A genetic generation can throw up anomalies, and that usually happens when there are older fathers in the line. So you want to examine your matches trees as well as your own, and look, are there any older fathers in the line? Are there any very long generations that could change the probability of the relationship? And estimate it from there. Endogamy, the dreaded word. Endogamy is the practice of marrying within the same ethnic, cultural, social, religious, or tribal group. In endogamous populations, everyone descends from the same small gene pool. So they're related to each other in many different ways, on many different pathways on the same tree. The same ancestors appear on several different places. If you've got a lot of endogamy in your tree, you're going to have to disregard predicted relationships and ranges of centimorgans, unfortunately. Because if you have a third cousin who's a third cousin 3 times over, as well as a fourth cousin once removed, they're going to share a lot more DNA with you than somebody who's just a third cousin in one way. So be very careful with that. People with endogamy generally have to look to higher matches to find connections than people without endogamy. Okay, so autosomal DNA results consist of 2 main components: the ethnicity estimate, or admixture, and the DNA match list. So let's have a quick look at these ethnicity estimates. This is my ancestry ethnicity estimate. Ireland and Scotland, 70%, etc. All of my ancestry is Irish and Scottish, so that's pretty reasonable. The bit I like about this are the regions, used to be known as genetic communities, the regions and sub-regions under Scotland and Ulster, where it's telling me Tyrone, Londonderry and Antrim, etc. These are actually based on your match's trees. So what the system is doing is it's going through the trees and it's finding lots of people who have ancestors from Antrim. So it's then putting you and them in the same group as the same sub-region, saying you're likely to also have ancestors from Antrim. This can be really useful, and I find it generally pretty accurate. I do certainly have ancestors from these places. However, ethnicity estimates will vary across companies. Look at my MyHeritage estimate. I've got this 28% Eastern European showing up all of a sudden, and I have no known Eastern European ancestry. So it's very different from what Ancestry has said. This is a MyOrigins ethnicity estimate from Family Tree DNA. And this is for my cousin Marion. And I wanted to show this one because it says 23% Ashkenazi Jewish. Now, Marion doesn't have any known Jewish ancestors, but she does have an unknown grandfather. So this is a really good clue to the ethnicity of that unknown grandfather. Ethnicity estimates, as I say, they vary between the companies, and the reason for that is because they all have their own different reference populations. They're only really accurate to the continental level, so don't take them too literally, and you will find errors. The estimate can only cover the DNA you've personally inherited from your ancestors, and you don't have all the same DNA they did. They can give you a broad idea of your origins and even provide clues if you have an unknown ancestor. But it's an emerging science, and although it will improve over time as more people test and reference populations increase, just don't take it too literally. Okay, on to the biggie, the DNA match list. As I say, it's all about the cousins. This is the key to using autosomal DNA to help with your family history. So a few initial tips for working with your match list. Start with your largest matches and work your way down. There's no point working on very tiny matches when you have nice high ones to work with. You're much more likely to be successful with the higher matches. Upload your family tree if you know anything at all. You're going to be helping yourself and others. Use DNA in conjunction with traditional research, as that's how to get the most out of both of them. You want to search your match lists for common surnames and common locations together. If a match has both, you've got a better chance of identifying the link. And often location searching is more fruitful than surname searching, especially if the surnames are common. Study the shared matches. They are the key to working out how you relate to your match. Be proactive. Contact your matches. Many won't respond, but keep trying and you will find new cousins to collaborate with and share with. Okay, so this isn't my Ancestry match list, and it's all changed recently. Ancestry have been doing an awful lot of updates, and the top of my match list is, of course, my close relatives who I've tested myself. I've tested a lot of relatives. But we can see some of these changes. Add to group, mother's side, notes on the home page, etc. Different filters are in place. Now, if this doesn't look familiar to you, that's because it's a beta feature. So big changes ahead, as I've said. The Ancestry's new beta features are called New and Improved DNA Matches, My Tree Tags, there's a new profile page, there's new messaging coming soon, and you have to opt in to use some of these new features. But you can enable and disable it anytime you like while they remain in beta testing. If you don't know how to opt in, this is how. Go to the extras bar, down to Ancestry Lab, and then on there, just enable the My Tree Tags and New and Improved DNA Matches features. So that's how to get the new features. And you can disable, as I say, anytime you like. So this gives you 24 color-coded groups so that you can organize your DNA matches into groups. You can organize them by ancestor, etc., which is really, really helpful. The notes are now on the main page, so there's less need for the Chrome extension, MedBetter DNA, which used to do that for you. The Chrome extensions, all of them, will not work with the new system for now. So if you're using Ancestry DNA Helper, etc., this won't work in the beta testing. One of the new features is through lines, and this has been integrated into the family trees as well. So this is one of my family trees, and if I click on the little DNA icon, and I go and turn the through lines icons on, I then see all of these little blue through lines icons on my family tree. And I can click in them and it will take me to their through lines. Now, be aware that there's going to be an icon even if you're the only person there. So don't expect too much, especially from the close relatives when you see this. It's going to be you and your close relatives that you've tested more than likely that you'll see. But check them all out. You might find something you haven't noticed before. For instance, I'm going to have a look at my ancestor, James Colquhoun. I'm going to view his through lines. And there's a bunch of people there. There's 3 people there. One of them I know, and the other 2 I don't. And in fact, this one down here, this 40 centimorgan match, I've tried to work her out a number of times over the years. She has a small 6-person tree, and I couldn't get past her grandmother. I had a feeling I knew which line it was, but I couldn't work it out. I couldn't get her any further back in Canada. Now, of course, her line is there. It's telling me she's descending from James Colquhoun, but everything's private. However, that's just saying that it's a private tree. And I can still get the names of these deceased people simply by clicking on that private box. It brings it up and it says, this private tree contains information about Annie Colquhoun, born in 1879. So now I know that it's my second great-grandmother Isabella's sister Annie that these people descend from. And I can do the same with her child and her grandchild. And I can now add this to my tree and I know how I match this person now. Whereas I didn't know that before. ThroughLines has given me that. However, the big caveat, there are going to be errors. Not all of these are going to be accurate. They are clues and only clues. So you must investigate each one. I had to check and look at the records and make sure all of this was correct before I was satisfied that this was genuine. So Don't just take it as read and say, oh, that's great, and add it to your tree. Make sure you investigate it first. All right, so build out your own tree. Direct ancestors, of course, but especially your collateral lines, because it's from the collateral lines that the cousins you're matching are going to come. And if you've got those lines built out, it's going to be much easier to identify them. So for instance, here's a new match of mine, MLK. She descends from Alfred Albert Kerr. And I have Kerrs, and I have built a very robust tree with collateral lines. So my first port of call should always be to check my own tree. Is this person on it? Well, he is on it, Alfred Albert Kerr. I didn't have his granddaughter, but I had him and his son. And he stems from my third great grandparents. So that means MLK is my third cousin once removed. So because of my tree, I've been able to work out this match really, really quickly, even although she didn't have the tree worked further back than her grandfather. Build out the trees of your matches. This is another really important point. You just need a starting point to do the work. So for instance, here's a match. This is on GEDmatch with Dan. Between me and Dan, it's only 30 centimorgans, but it's an interesting match to me because Dan has a great-grandfather, James Mitchell, who was born in a little place called Rappo in Donegal in Ireland. Now, I have Mitchell ancestors from that exact same place. This is my maternal second great-grandmother, Isabella's tree, and her mother was Mary, born in 1843 in Rappo. So James is, you would think a generation below Mary. So I had to investigate, where did this James come from? Could he relate to my Mitchells? Now, my Mary's parents were James Mitchell and Marjorie McCarran. So I tracked down Dan's great-grandfather's Pennsylvania death record, and it tells me that his father was James Mitchell from Ireland, his mother was Frances Rogers from Ireland. And I found that James Mitchell, the older one, aged 76 on the 1911 census. So that would have him be born in the sort of 1830s, 40s. But there's no sign of a death for him in Ireland. So what could have happened to him? Well, initially I thought, well, maybe he went to the States as well. But in actual fact, he went to Scotland. Hurrah! Because if he died in Ireland, there would be no parents' names on the death certificate. But in Scotland, there are. And they're down as John Mitchell, it was James really, and Marjorie McCarran. So I've now proven that Dan's second great-grandfather and my third great-grandmother were siblings. So he and I are fourth cousins once removed. But by building out his tree, I've now found a sibling for my Mary that I didn't know existed. Make the system work for you. Okay, so upload your tree on Ancestry, link your tree to your DNA results on Family Tree DNA, upload your tree and use the linked relationship tool. If you upload your tree, the ancestral surnames you share with a match are put in bold to help you. If you link relationships on your tree with the people who've DNA tested, so I've linked my mother to her spot in my tree, that populates these maternal, paternal, and both buckets. So that can filter my matches by maternal and paternal, which is really useful. Same thing, I've linked all my paternal first cousins, so that populates my paternal bucket. Not all of your cousins are going to match you. So you have to be aware of the fact that up to the second cousin level, so second cousins are closer, everyone is going to match you. Everyone should match you. So if you have a first cousin, for instance, who doesn't match you, then there's a problem. However, past the second cousin level, this starts to change. Only around 90% of third cousins will match each other. So if you're not matching a third cousin, you might be in that 10% that just don't match each other. It gets even smaller as time goes by. Fourth cousins, it's 50-50 as to whether you're going to match them. With fifth cousins, only 10% of them will match you. So just be aware of that. Not all of your matches will be real cousins. Now, this is quite complicated and I can't go into the science of it today, but there are many small segments that are false, and these are known as identical by chance. Research suggests 100% of segments of 15 centimorgans in size or larger are identical by descent, which means genuine, real segments. But only 14% of 5 centimorgan segments are real. This doesn't mean totally discount smaller matches, especially if you find the common surnames and locations, but you have to be careful with them, and please don't make them a main focus, because if you've got lots of matches over 20, 30, 40 centimorgans to work with, as most of us do with more and more people testing now, there's really no point spending your time working on tiny segments that might be false. And there are very, very few matches, even in the 20 to 30 centimorgan range, that you can work out the common ancestors for. So, as I say, work with your highest matches and be aware that small segments can be false. Test your older generations, if at all possible. They've simply got more of our ancestors' DNA than we do. Our parents have double, our grandparents have triple. So just as an example, here is a family tree DNA match to me, PM. She's a 5th cousin to remote is the relationship range, 37 centimorgans, etc. Longest block of only 8. Now be very careful with the shared centimorgan number on family tree DNA. I always suggest looking in the chromosome browser and adding up any segments over 7 centimorgans, because family tree DNA does take into account tiny segments such as 1, 2, 3, and 4 centimorgans. But let's look at PM and how she matches my dad's first cousin, who's that magic generation closer to the common ancestors than I am. Much, much closer, 155 and a 55 longest block. So I wouldn't look at PM normally on my list. It's too small. But as soon as I see how she matches my dad's first cousin, I then look at the match. And of course, she was my 3rd cousin, and she is my dad's first cousin's 2nd cousin once removed. So another big question I get often is, should I test my siblings? Is there any point in testing them? They'll be too like me, won't they? And the answer to that question is always, it depends. You can only answer it with another question. Do you have parents to test? If the answer is yes, both my parents are alive and they're both willing to test, then test both your parents. Siblings aren't going to give you any more if you can test your parents. If the answer is no, or if I've only got one, then it's a big fat yes. Yes, you should test your siblings. And to talk about why, let's go back and have another look at how autosomal DNA is inherited. So here's mum and dad again. And here's you. You're still female for the purposes of this illustration. Dad's autosomal DNA is, we're going to call it a pack of 100 DNA cards. And he's shuffling his cards up and he passes down a random 50 to you. Mum does the same, shuffles them up, random 50. You've now got 100 DNA cards of your own. A unique mix of 50% mum, 50% dad. Fast forward a few years, along comes pesky little brother. And dad is reshuffling his pack of cards and he's passing down a random 50 to brother. Mum, she goes and does the same. Now, pesky little brother has got 100 cards from mum and dad, just like you did. But did he get the same 100 cards? Only if he was an identical twin. So it's really useful to test your siblings, because you're only going to share, let's say, using my card analogy, around 50 of those cards with them. And there's 50 you're not going to share. So between you, you're going to have around 150 of your parents' cards, basically maybe around 75% of their DNA instead of only 50% by testing yourself. So it's really useful to test siblings, because they're going to match other people you don't match on segments of DNA passed down from your parents that you didn't get. Just as an example of this, here's a match on 23andMe, BC. He's sharing 0.4 DNA with me. He's quite far down my list. He's not one I would look at really in general. But when I tested my brother, who's one of his highest matches? BC, sharing 2.12% of their DNA. That's a lot of DNA. It's actually 159 centimorgans, and he's only 32 with me. So this made me investigate BC, and it turns out he's my second cousin once removed. It's an outlier for me, but average sharing for my brother. And again, the reason I know it's an outlier is because of all the different people I've tested and all the extra evidence I have about how BC matches everybody else. If I only could see how he matched me, then I would be thinking there's probably a problem here. So how do you narrow down your test results? Well, you test your older generations if you can. They can narrow things furthest. If you don't have older generations to test your peers, your half-siblings, your first cousins, your second cousins. First cousin can narrow to grandparents, second cousin to great-grandparents. So how does this work? Well, here's a match, SJ. And if I didn't have any confirmed relatives tested, I wouldn't be able to narrow this match down to maternal or paternal. But I do. So first thing is, she doesn't match my mum. So it's paternal straight away. She matches 4 of my paternal first cousins. It's not narrowing anything, but it's again confirming it's paternal. She matches my dad's first cousin on his mother's side. So now I've got it narrowed down to my paternal grandmother. And she matches my second cousin once removed, who is again a magic generation closer. So she's now narrowed down to my great-grandmother's 8th of my tree. My great-grandmother, Janet Kerr Stevenson Cullen, and her parents, John Cullen and Janet Nichol. So, breaking down a brick wall. This is a brick wall. Robert Cullen, Janet's grandfather. He was born in around 1800. He died in the 1820s in Glasgow. There's no documentation to tell me who his parents were, so I'm stuck with him. Now, I found this birth a long time ago, born the 7th of June 1802 in Glasgow, but I don't even know if my Robert was born in Glasgow. I just know he died there. And before 1855 in Scotland, there was no, people were not compelled to register births. So there could be other Robert Cullens out there born around that time that was my Robert Cullen. I can't take this and decide this is my Robert. But I've always had it aside as a possibility, just something I can't prove and is very speculative. So a new DNA match comes along when I first started out, Jan, and she shares a lot of surnames with me, including Cullen and Whitehead, and it turns out that she's descended from the same third great-grandparents as I am. So we're 4th cousins exactly. And she's got John Cullen and Elizabeth Morton, the parents of that Robert that was born in 1802, on her tree. So does she know something I don't? Well, she's got her great-grandmother's name as Elizabeth Morton Johnston. So that's quite interesting. So I went and looked in the Australian records, and indeed she did call herself Elizabeth Morton Johnston. So I've now added a little piece of evidence that perhaps this Elizabeth Morton really was my Robert's mother, but it's still not cast iron. So let's go back to SJ, who we were looking at not that long ago. And here's her tree, and she's got a grandfather called Thomas Cullen. And it says he died in Glasgow, and that's all the information she's got. So, common surname, common location, that's worth investigating. So I looked up the marriage, and parents were Robert Cullen and Margaret Cullen. I then looked up the next one back, the next marriage back, to Thomas Cullen and Martha McLean. I then looked up the death of Thomas Cullen, and we've got William Cullen and Sarah Morrison, and the death of William Cullen, John Cullen, and Elizabeth Morton. So, SJ descends from them. And in fact, I now have 6 or 7 matches that descend from different children of John Cullen and Elizabeth Morton. So I am as sure as I possibly can be that my Robert is their son. And I've been able to add all of this information to my tree, and even a relative sent me some fantastic family photographs from the 1850s. And I wouldn't have any of that without the DNA matches. We're only 40 minutes in. So confirming lines on my tree. So let's focus on a match on my mum's list. And we're going to look at Christy. And Christy shares, we're going to look at the in common with list on family tree DNA for Christy, okay? And she is matching my mum's first cousin Isabel. So that tells me that I can narrow things down to my mum's mother. So I want to look in the chromosome browser. Now the chromosome browser shows you the exact segments of DNA that you share with a match. And the thing that stands out to me here is that Christy and my mum are matching each other on chromosome 7. And Christy also shares one other segment with my mum, but as we can see, Isabel is the blue. She's not sharing that segment too, so I want to focus on the chromosome 7 one. So I have to view the data in a table, and we can see that Christy shares 38 centimorgans with my mum. And again, doing what I told you about earlier, I've added them up to 71 centimorgans and cut out all the tiny segments. So this is what we call triangulation. What we need to know is, Isabel matches my mum in chromosome 7, Christy matches my mum in chromosome 7. Are they matching on the same copy? Well, the million-dollar question, yes, they are. They're all matching on the same copy. Now, you want to go from the start location, the furthest start location, which is how Isabel matches my mum, to the lowest end location, which is exactly the same for both of them. So they're all matching on the same copy of chromosome 7, which tells us that they share a common ancestor. We've triangulated. Mum, Isabel, and Christy all match each other on the same copy, so they have the same common ancestor from whom they inherited that segment of DNA. Now, if we look at the common surnames, again, they're bolded because I've added my family tree. Christy has a tree. She has a ancestor called William Berry, who's our 4th great-grandfather, and he was married to a Mary Bullock. And I also have a William Berry on my tree, but he was married to a Mary Somerville. So were they cousins or something like that? Are they related in some way? Well, this is the marriage of my William Berry and Mary Somerville in 1860. He was a carter and a bachelor, apparently. He was also about 10 years older than he said he was. 39, nope. And this is the William Berry that married Mary Bullock 20 years earlier. And this is that Mary Bullock on the 1841 census living with my Berry family. So he was the same William Berry, the exact same man. Kirsty and I are 4th cousins once removed. However, Mary Bullock, well, she didn't die. She was still alive on the 1861 census after he'd married Mary number 2, my Mary. So my William has been a naughty boy and committed a bit of bigamy. And he was actually caught. Mary number 1 went to the police and told on him, and he went to prison for bigamy. So a little tip, use the notes field to keep track of what you're doing. Whatever company you're on, add notes about everything you've been doing, about the amounts shared, any common ancestors you've worked out, messages you've sent, etc. I'm going to skip this bit. So we're running low on time. And we're going to talk a little bit about X DNA matches. Now, the X chromosome is included with autosomal DNA tests, but not visible on Ancestry or MyHeritage. A match on the X chromosome is different to a match on an autosomal chromosome. And why is that? Well, you can only inherit X chromosome DNA from certain ancestors, and your gender is a big factor. Women have twice the X men do, and thus have many more matches. X DNA can pass through several generations untouched, so often a match on the X is further back than a match on an autosomal chromosome. This is a male X DNA chart, and you can see all of these white ancestors. These are people you can't have got any X DNA from. So there's only a very limited number of people on the mother's side for a man that X DNA could have come from. For a woman, there are more possibilities, but again, you can cut out a whole lot of different ancestors, especially the maternal grandfather and the paternal grandfather, that kind of thing. I always advise people to create their own X DNA table with their own ancestors on it. So this is mine. I've filled it in with all of my different ancestors that I could have got X DNA from. So this is a new match I got with H, 297 centimorgans across 14 segments. So it's a really good match. He was on Ancestry though, so I couldn't see X DNA there, but he uploaded to Family Tree DNA. And we have a really big X match. We share 2 massive segments, 45 centimorgans and 48 centimorgans on the X chromosome. So that tells me that I match H through his mother. I have to. That all came from his mother. It's also my paternal X, so it came from my paternal grandmother. So we've not, using the X chromosome, we've narrowed things down both on his side and my side. And H, in fact, turns out to be my paternal grandmother's sister's grandson, my second cousin. We'll skip these advanced tools. Third-party tools. Aids to help you with DNA matching. Make use of third-party tools. The most important of these is GEDmatch, which is a fantastic and free third-party tool that can help you match against those who've tested at all the major testing companies, and it provides better tools for analysing matches. DNA-GEDcom offers a suite of tools. GenomeMate Pro is an excellent program for organising your DNA data, but it can be time-consuming. And DNA Painter is a fantastic tool for chromosome mapping, and Johnny Pearl, the originator of that, will be talking about it. So this is GEDmatch. The key points on GEDmatch are one-to-many, one-to-one, one-to-one-X, and people who match both are one of two kits, which is a bit of a mouthful. These are basically the shared match list. People who match both were one of two kits, that's the shared match list. The one-to-many is your overall match list, and the one-to-ones are like your individual match pages telling you about the centimorgans you share. This is a look at DNA Painter, where you can map your chromosomes back to your ancestors. So these are segments of DNA, and you're color coding them and showing which ancestors you got these segments from through confirmed relatives that have tested and you match against. As I say, Johnny will be talking more about that. We'll skip GenomeMate Pro. For more on third-party tools, I have done a full talk on this, a webinar on legacy family tree webinars, which you can watch there, and there's a link to that in my handout. Few resources: the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, ISOG. You can join, it's free. There's a stand out there if you want some advice or information. Explore the ISOG wiki. There are so many articles there, so much help to be had. Read blogs, join Facebook groups, watch webinars, YouTube videos. There's so much help out there. Take advantage of it all. There's some great traditional literature too, which we talked about earlier. Both Emily Olicino is out on the Family Tree DNA stand. She is the author of Genetic Genealogy, The Basics and Beyond, and Blaine Bettinger's Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy. And just a heads up that very soon, Tracing Your Ancestors Using DNA, a guide for family historians, will be published by Pen and Swords. And this is a book which is a collaboration between myself and several colleagues, edited by Graham Holton from Strathclyde University, and chapters by John Cleary, Graham, myself, Alistair MacDonald, and Ian MacDonald. So that is slated for release in the 30th of June. So summing up, use your DNA results in conjunction with traditional research for best results. Test close relatives, especially older generations, to narrow your matches down and gain more of your ancestors' DNA to work with. Upload your family tree, no matter how small. Make cousin connections and work together. Organize your data and take advantage of all the help out there. Practice, 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 and have fun with it. This is the handout link if anyone wants to take a photograph or take it down. And that's it.
Thank you, Michelle. Great. Thanks, Michelle Leonard. We have time for a few questions as well. So are there any immediate questions from the audience? How many people, there's a question over here. How many people have actually done a DNA test? All right, okay.
Right.
So everybody's wanting to learn how to interpret it. I'm just a bit frightened of that speaker.
How likely am I to be able to find my great-grandmother's father, because she was illegitimate?
Okay.
So it's a third great-grandfather to me. I don't know who it is.
Your third great-grandfather, as you're saying.
Yes, third great-grandfather.
It can be done. It has been done. I'm not going to say it's easy, because it's not. It takes a lot of work and a lot of luck with the matches that you get. The parts of my talk where I was talking about narrowing matches down and testing lots of different family members to narrow matches down, that's really what you need to do to try and get to the bottom of something that's so far back. You have to be able to narrow the DNA of that mystery person down, and you have to get more of the mystery man's DNA in the database. So think about all of his descendants. Who else can you test to get more of his DNA? By testing yourself, you've got a little of his DNA, but are there any older generation relatives still around that have got more of his DNA? Are there any siblings or cousins of yours that have got more of his DNA? The more of his DNA you have to work with, and the more easily you can narrow lines down to the mystery, the better chance you have. It can be done at that level. I have done it, others have done it, but it could take years. and it will take a bit of luck and a lot of hard work.
Is your great-great-grandfather on the direct male line? Father, father, father.
Yeah, that's another good point.
That was the other thing.
Yeah,
if he was, you
another
could
good
do a
point.
Y-DNA test, and that might give you a clue to his surname.
Yeah.
It's on your mother's side, so the Y-DNA is not going to help unless...
Yeah, unless you could find somebody, you know.
Yeah, unless you can find a direct male line down from that mystery.
You don't have to do Y-DNA testing only on your own Y-DNA line. So if you looked, if it depends if your ancestor is a woman or not. So if the next level down, you're saying it's your third great grandfather, but who's the next line down? Is it a woman or a man? Your second great grandmother, then you're out of luck on the Y.
Did she have any brothers? And did they have any children? Any sons who had sons who had sons?
The brothers aren't guaranteed to have been fathered by the same man, are they?
No. So there's it's complicated, but, you know, it's a bit like Sudoku. You put your mind to it, you can figure it out eventually.
It's detective work, and, you know, that's, it's addictive once you get started on it.
If you played with a Rubik's Cube when you were a kid, then you're probably in a good position. Other questions? We have a question from this lady down here.
I was recommended the living DNA, and they don't have the matches like Ancestry. So is it only through Ancestry that you find all these, like third cousin, the different cousins and everything?
No, not just Ancestry, although they have the largest database. So there's around 15 million people tested at Ancestry now. There's over 10 million at 23andMe. 2.5 million at MyHeritage. FTDNA don't give numbers, but their database has been around a long time as well. You will get matches at all four of those. They're the big four databases. But Living DNA's matching is literally just getting off the ground, so you're not going to see matching there at that level for a very long time.
The other thing was one of the reasons why we took Living DNA was because we've been told that Ancestry wasn't as good with people in this country.
That will be talking about ethnicity only. And as I've said, a lot of people are just interested in ethnicity, and that's fine. But for the purposes of family history, you really want to be working with matches. And you have to fish in the biggest ponds and all the ponds if you want to work with matches.
That's an interesting point, though, about Living DNA's population admixture function, because they are using the data from the People of the British Isles project, 2,000 people, all who had four grandparents from exactly the same location, so within 30 miles of each other. So by sampling people all over the country who had four grandparents from a specific location, they were able to put together a genetic map of Britain from around about 1880. Because that's when the average grandparent would have been born. So they have a very, very granular, fine, detailed ethnic makeup. I mean, it's beyond ethnic because it's a subgroup of Western European, basically. But they can narrow down. So if you match somebody, it'll give you might be able to locate exactly what county in Britain that match comes from, and then you'll be able to relate it to a county in your family tree where it probably is most likely to be related. So that's kind of the potential of Living DNA, and the fact that they're using this really, really fine detailed database as a comparative database for your DNA when you send it in there. The other important point to make, of course, is that if you've tested with other companies, you can transfer your data for free, is it?
Well, to Living DNA, it's free, but you don't get the ethnicity breakdown. So if you want that, you have to pay for a Living DNA test, and you also don't get the haplogroups or any of that because it's a different particular test. You can transfer for free from Ancestry or 23andMe into Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage, but if you want to use things like the chromosome browser and other advanced tools, then you have to pay a small fee. At Family Tree DNA, it's $19. At MyHeritage, it's $29.
We have a question. We have two final questions down here. I'm going to take the lady at the back first.
How much influence does recessive genes, things like ginger hair, have on the ethnicity tests? Because I've looked on both Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. One gives me
8% Sicilian ancestry. One gives me 25%. All my ancestors back to the late 1700s are Scottish.
Yeah. I don't think that has anything to do with ginger hair. I don't. I can't say for sure if recessive genes have any bearing on, but I don't think they have any bearing on ethnicity at all.
You've
As you can
this
see, and you've seen my ethnicity estimates as well. So I don't think your ethnicity is coming from that.
And you have to take the ethnicity estimates with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, quite a large pinch of it, yeah.
I was 20% British until March last year, and then in April they changed me to 100% Irish, and my accent changed overnight. Question here.
I was in the original Oxford University study. I was one of the people who was tested for that. So it's a couple of things around that. First of all, I've had my parents tested now, modern DNA through living DNA. Would that have skewed the results at all, the fact they're comparing them to me, same DNA? And secondly, can I use the DNA that was taken at the Oxford University and move that into, say, Ancestry?
I didn't hear the first part of the question, Morris.
So you were tested was it Oxford Ancestors or Oxford University? The Oxford University project was in 2004, and that was an academic project?
The one that's used as a reference population by living DNA.
Okay, so that was the People of the British Isles project. I think in that particular project, as is the case in many of the academic projects, they don't actually give the participants their DNA results.
You can't
you're probably not going to be able to get those at all.
No.
They are probably somewhere in the living DNA database. Yes, so...
It now means my parents, who I've tested recently with living DNA, are actually getting compared against me as a reference person. And is that skewing the results?
I wouldn't think so. No, I mean, the reference populations are large, and you're just one person. So that's not going to skew results for your parents. No.
You are who you are still.
Yeah.
That's the important... Well, that's all we have time for, but thanks for some wonderful questions from the audience, and thanks very much to Michelle Leonard for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.